wisdom of the middle way. Nagarjuna's Mulamadhyamakakarika. Translation and commentary by J. L. Garfield. Part 2, the text and commentary. Chapter 27, Examination of Views. The final chapter of the text, like the previous chapter, applies the results of the climactic analyses of chapters 24 and 25. It is noteworthy that all of the classic erroneous views discussed and refuted in this chapter are refuted earlier in the text. Indeed, chapters 24 and XXV are immediately preceded by a chapter on errors. One might therefore think that this chapter is otiose, or at least misplaced. For here Nagarjuna considers a range of alternative metaphysical views conflicting with Nagarjuna's analysis in terms of emptiness. These views are all well known and considered false by all schools of Buddhist philosophy. So why does Nagarjuna return to them as a collection at the close of the text?
The previous chapter demonstrated the positive payoff of the analysis of emptiness and its relation to conventional phenomena. Nagarjuna there argued that one can exploit emptiness and an understanding of emptiness in following the path to nirvana. But the pursuit of the path entails the elimination of error. In fact, it can negatively be characterized, as we saw in the nirvana chapter, specifically as the elimination of error. So it is important for Nagarjuna to show that the analysis developed in 24 and 25 can not only promote positive movement toward nirvana but also the eradication of the erroneous views that bind us to samsara. That is the burden of this final chapter. It is also important dialectically to see that Nagarjuna is demonstrating that the root of all of these erroneous views is the view that the self or the external world exist inherently. If, he will argue, one grants either of those claims, one is stuck with one or more of these errors. It therefore follows that any view, including any view of any other Buddhist school including all of the schools that castigate these views on independent grounds that posits inherently existent entities will succumb to these errors. Nagarjuna thus concludes by arguing not only that his position is capable of leading to nirvana, but that it is the only position capable of doing so.
1. The views in the past I was, or I was not, and the view that the world is permanent, etc. All of these views depend on a prior limit. Nagarjuna summarizes the diagnosis he will offer of the error underlying these metaphysical views. Any view that the self is permanent or non-existent or that the world is permanent or non-existent presupposes that one can think coherently about the beginning of time or of identity. For to think of things as permanent requires us either to posit a beginning of time from which they existed, or to assert that time has no beginning. To think that there was a past at which the self did not exist or in which the world did not exist presupposes that we can mark a point at which the world came into existence or at which there is a definite separation between a world without the self and a world with the self, an initial moment of personal existence. 2. The view, in the future I will become other, or, I will not do so, and that the world is limited, etc. All of these views depend on a final limit. Similarly, such views require us to be able to talk coherently about the end of the world or the end of personal existence, to be able to speak of a future time where nothing exists, or of the end of time, or of an unlimited future existence or of a definite moment when the self ceases to exist, whereas before it had existed. Nagarjuna begins by discussing arguments regarding the self, opening with a set of arguments for the permanence of the self.
3. To say, I was in the past, is not tenable. What existed in the past is not identical to this one. It is a fundamental confusion to think that because I can say that I or someone or something else existed in the past that there is a real identity between what exists now and what existed then. Identity requires that we share all properties, and that is trivially impossible over time. But any assertion of the permanence of the self requires that we be able to identity it over time. For, according to you, this self is that, but the appropriator is different. If it is not the appropriator, what is your self? Suppose that one through introspection or analysis takes some putative entity, one's body, one stream of consciousness, or whatever to be one's self. There will be in that act a duality of appropriator and the thing appropriated as the self or as part of the self. But at different times what is appropriated and what is appropriating differ. both subject and object will necessarily be distinct. But in order to posit the appropriating entity as the self, it must retain its identity over time. The sequence of appropriators hence fails to provide a candidate for a continuing self. But, Nagarjuna points out, there is no other candidate.
5. Having shown that there is no self other than the appropriator. The appropriator should be the self. But it is not yourself. The self that is posited by the advocate of a permanent self is a substantial entity capable of grasping, not a mere evanescent activity. So it cannot be the appropriator. Moreover, Nagarjuna points out in the next verse, the same argument applies, mutatis mutandis, to the act of appropriation. To identify that with the self would be to identify agent and action. 6. Appropriating is not the self. It arises and ceases. How can one accept that? Future appropriating is the appropriator? Two problems are developed in this verse. First of all, the self that the reificationist wishes to posit is a permanent, enduring self. But appropriating is a momentary action that arises and ceases constantly with new objects of appropriation. A sequence of such actions is hardly a substantial subject. This is a straightforwardly Humean argument. Second, Nagarjuna points out, even if one argued that the self was substantial and also identical to that sequence, there is a further difficulty. The self that is posited by this interlocutor is an enduring subject of these acts of appropriation. But some of the members of the sequence have yet to come into existence. If the self exists entirely at all moments of time, as an unchanging substantial subject, it cannot be identified with a sequence, some of whose members are not presently existent.
7. A self that is different from the appropriating is not tenable. If it were different, then in a non-appropriator there should be appropriation. But there isn't. This is a very obscure argument as it is put in the text, but given the context we can flesh it out. The target position here is one according to which the existence of appropriation as a real, persistent feature of cyclic existence is used as the basis for attributing personal identity to a continuing self. That self is not supposed to be the appropriating itself, but rather a separate entity independent of it. Nagarjuna points out, though, that it is, and for the proponent of this view, it must be possible not to appropriate, otherwise nirvana would be impossible. So, there will be a non-appropriator who once was an appropriator. But if appropriation is the basis of the identity of the one who has been liberated with the one who was not, that appropriation should persist in the non-appropriator, which would be contradictory. 8. So it is neither different from the appropriating nor identical to the appropriating.